Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another live chat with James, coming to you from the studios in Vancouver, British Columbia. At this hour, of course, we have all heard that the United States has launched a missile attack on Iran, targeting their uranium enrichment facilities. At this time, it is understood by the Trump administration that although Iran did not have the nuclear warheads or the nuclear missiles at this time, they could, allegedly by the United States, have them within a very short period, as little as two weeks to 2 months' time. Whether or not this is accurate, of course, we don't know. There has been infighting between Donald Trump and Tulsi Gabbard and the United States Intelligence Service, so it's hard to say where the facts may lie. At this time, there is much dispute around the world whether or not the United States is acting within international law, within the UN regulations and articles, and even within the United States law. The attacks at this time and the launch of U.S. military personnel to drop these, what they refer to as bunker busters, on the nuclear facilities or uranium enrichment facilities in Iran is under the, I believe it was Article 2. And that gives Trump some certain powers when it comes to launching war, or at least launching the U.S. into these isolated attacks. Whether or not this will remain isolated is one question, of course, at the top of everyone's mind. Iran has very realistically said that they will retaliate, and it is a very big probability that they will. The question is, of course, will they turn around and retaliate against U.S. military installations or facilities on the international scale, or will they instead decide to take terrorist activities to a new height within the borders of the United States of America? Of course, various countries are warning their citizens that they may want to avoid or at least use extreme caution if traveling to the United States after this very, very urgent escalation in the attack on Iran and what potentially could be a war breaking out between Iran, Israel, and the United States at a higher level. Of course, we also know that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump have been very buddy-buddy over the last several years, even from his first term. Whether or not there has been direct influence of Netanyahu, of course, we can speculate that there definitely was. But what the call and decision was, whether it was Trump's or whether it was Netanyahu's, we have yet to find out. Pete Hegseth stood behind Donald Trump along with Marco Rubio and Vice President J.D. Vance at the announcement that Trump held at the White House earlier this evening. Of course, with that said, Pete Hegseth was not mentioned directly within the action plan or the actions that were taken when it came to Trump making the announcement. This really is an unusual situation where Donald Trump, of course, crying like a little schoolgirl again that, oh, he's done this to stop a war between Rwanda and the Congo. He has done that to stop wars and violence between others. He played a role in bringing peace between Pakistan and India. And why won't anybody give him a Nobel Peace Prize? Of course, he just whines about it because he's, of course, Donald Trump, and everybody's out to get him, everybody's against him, and he has his own little pity party. But at the same time, as he is crying about not getting a Nobel Peace Prize, he is planning to bomb Iran, which he did all in the same day. This should be very concerning, not only for his MAGA supporters, but for all Americans at this point, when Iran has the capability and the fortitude to, again, advance attacks on the U.S., whether it is on foreign U.S. military locations and targets, or if they decide to take it closer to the United States on a Western front or on a very aggressive front. Now let's take a closer look at what's gone on today, what's transpired, and how the international community has definitely taken notice and responded, including the United Nations, outside of the U.S., international leaders, of course, showed much concern about the escalation in this current situation, and rightfully so. With that said, let's go on to take a deeper dive into what is currently going on with this situation and where it could lead. So let's start at the top here. Of course, on June the 21st, the United States executed significant military strikes against three pivotal Iranian nuclear facilities. Those are located at Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. President Donald Trump publicly declared the operation a very successful attack, asserting that Iran's key nuclear sites were completely and fully obliterated through the deployment of specialized bunker buster bombs. Particularly in the deeply fortified Fordo plant, the direct intervention by the United States marked a dramatic escalation occurring after more than a week of intensified conflict between Israel and Iran. During which time, of course, Israel has been conducting its own systemic strikes against Iranian military and nuclear facilities and assets. Now, the military action immediately ignited a profound constitutional debate within the United States, centering on the extent of the presidential authority under Article 2 of the Constitution versus the war powers vested in Congress. And there are a lot of people speaking out on social media if you happen to be paying attention to that this evening. Now, the international community reacted with widespread condemnation and deep concern, with numerous nations and international bodies, including the United Nations, questioning the legality of those strikes under the UN Charters of fundamental prohibition on the use of force and the stringent conditions of self-defense. We'll take a deep dive into this as well as we move forward here. Now, the diplomatic fallout was immediate and stark. With that, of course, we turn around, and while that's going on, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu lauded the U.S. action as a bold decision and confirmed full coordination. Iran's leadership vowed harsh retaliation and vehemently accused the United States of state terrorism and a gross violation of international law. The broader international community expressed grave alarm, consistently urging de-escalation and a return of diplomatic solutions, highlighting profound fears of a widening and much more serious conflict and dangerous erosion of established international legal norms. Now, the overview of the escalating Iran-Israel conflict and the U.S. maximum pressure campaign, let's take a deeper look at that. Now, the United States military action on June the 21st, yesterday, unfolded against a backdrop of severely heightened tensions and an active 9-day conflict between Israel and Iran. During this period, Israel has been engaged in a sustained campaign to dismantle Iran's air defenses and offensive missile capabilities, while also targeting its nuclear enrichment facilities. The regional conflagration provided the immediate context for the U.S. intervention, while inserting American forces directly into an already volatile situation. Prior to these kinetic actions, the Trump administration had consistently pursued a maximum pressure campaign against Iran. This policy was initiated following the U.S. withdrawal from the Obama-era Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. That happened in 2018, an agreement President Trump had famously denounced as the worst deal ever, which is pretty much what he says about any deal, including ones that he has made himself. The maximum pressure strategy involved the reimposition of stringent sanctions, including secondary sanctions across nearly all sectors of the Iranian economy, with the explicit aim of driving Iran's oil exports to zero and severing its access to crucial revenue. The administration justified this aggressive economic posture by citing the Iranian regime's alleged funding of terrorist proxies in the Middle East and the rapid advancement of its nuclear capabilities, characterizing these as grave threats to U.S. safety and security. The transition from strategy, primarily reliant on economic coercion, to the kinetic action represents a significant strategic pivot. The research indicates that the maximum pressure campaign, despite its intensity and broad scope, may have been perceived as insufficient to achieve the administration's stated objectives regarding Iran's nuclear program or its regional influence. The decision to employ military force, particularly high-impact bunker buster bombs designed to deeply buried targets, suggests a calculated shift towards a more aggressive and inherently high-risk approach. This strategic evolution raises critical questions about the long-term efficacy of such a shift and the potential for unintended far-reaching consequences that extend beyond the immediate military objectives. Now let's take a chronological look at events leading to this U.S. intervention. Now, the path to the June 2025 strikes was paved by several key developments. The U.S. withdrawal from the 2015 nuclear deal in 2018 served as a foundational point, and that was in terms of dismantling a diplomatic framework that had sought to constrain Iran's nuclear activities. In the months preceding the strikes, President Trump's administration had engaged in renewed diplomatic efforts, including high-level direct negotiations with Iranian officials, specifically aimed at persuading Tehran to curb its nuclear program peacefully. Evidence suggests that President Trump had twice, in April and again in late May of 2025, successfully persuaded Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to defer military action against Iran, thereby allowing more time for these diplomatic initiatives to unfold. However, despite these diplomatic overtures and President Trump's public declaration of a 2-week deadline for a final decision on military action, the strikes were launched abruptly just 2 days later. This rapid and decisive action appears to have been significantly influenced by external factors. The research indicates that the decision was made at the prodding of Israeli officials and many Republican lawmakers who viewed Israel's ongoing military operation as unique and an unparalleled opportunity to deliver a potentially permanent setback to Iran's nuclear program. The strong statements of congratulation and confirmation of full coordination from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu following the strikes further underscores the significant influence of Allied pressures on this critical U.S. foreign policy decision. This dynamic raises important questions about the degree of independent decision-making in U.S. foreign policy, particularly in highly volatile regions. And how the interests and urgings of key allies can accelerate or fundamentally alter military engagements. Now let's take a look at some of the specifics of the U.S. military action, their targets, ordnance, and stated objectives. The United States operation targeted 3 specific sites within Iran. That was Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. These locations were identified as crucial components in Iran's nuclear infrastructure. A notable aspect of the attack was the specific use of those bunker buster bombs that I spoke about earlier. Against Iran's Fordo nuclear enrichment plant, a facility renowned for being built deep into a mountain. These specialized weapons are engineered to penetrate hardened underground structures before detonation, indicating a deliberate and precise targeting strategy aimed at destroying deeply embedded facilities. Donald Trump publicly announced the success of the strikes via social media, stating, "We have completed our very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran, including Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. The planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo. All planes are safely on their way home." In a subsequent televised address from the Oval Office, President Trump further asserted that Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated. It is important to note, however, that no independent damage assessment was available at the time to corroborate the full extent of the claimed destruction, and we all know that Trump is so full of shit that it's hard to take anything he says at face value. Now, the stated objectives behind these strikes were clear: to destroying the country's nuclear program and to set back Iran's nuclear program perhaps permanently. President Trump had consistently vowed that he would not permit Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. This military action, explicitly framed as preventative strike, was taken not in response to what Iran had already done, but rather against what it might someday do. This approach, targeting nuclear latency or potential future capability, fundamentally changes the traditional international legal framework governing the use of force, which typically requires an actual or imminent armed attack. By acting against a perceived future threat, the United States is seen as some by normalizing a dangerous precedent where mere suspicion or potential capabilities could be deemed sufficient to justify armed intervention. This could have profound and destabilizing ripple effects on global non-proliferation efforts, potentially incentivizing other states to accelerate their nuclear programs to achieve a full deterrent, thereby making the world less stable. Now let's take a look at whether or not Trump actually had the constitutional authority under Article 2 and the war powers debate that's going on in the United States right now. Now, the Trump administration's decision to launch military strikes against Iran without explicit congressional approval immediately reignited a long-standing constitutional debate regarding the scope of presidential authority. Supporters of President Trump's actions, including legal scholar John Yoo, contended that Article 2 of the Constitution, which designates the president as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy, grants broad, inherent authority to direct military operations abroad. This interpretation posits that the president possesses the necessary power to protect the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States without requiring a formal declaration of war or specific authorization from Congress for every military engagement. Now, historically, the historical precedent is frequently invoked to bolster this argument, with proponents noting numerous instances where presidents from both major parties have deployed U.S. forces and ordered military action without prior congressional authorization. Several examples of this would be the Trump administration citing its Article 2 powers for missile strikes against Syria in 2017, and for the fatal drone strike against Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Similarly, President Joseph Biden also relied on the 2002 authorization for use of military force, or the UAMF, and the same Article 2 powers to justify military actions against Iran-backed militant groups in Iraq. There were actions at that time against the militant groups in Syria, Yemen, and the Red Sea. Now, John Yoo has articulated that the framers of the Constitution, being very practical men, did not intend for Congress's power to declare war to serve as an absolute check on the president's ability to use military force. He argued that Congress is inherently slow to act and a large body that deliberates, whereas it's the president who acts swiftly and decisively in defense of the nation. Now let's take a look at the Congressional War Powers and the War Powers Resolution, or the WPR. Now, in contrast to the expansive view of presidential powers, critics of the unilateral strikes emphasize Congress's constitutional role in authorizing military force. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution explicitly grants the Congress the sole authority to declare war and to raise and support armies. The authority led to the enactment of the War Powers Resolution in 1973, passed over President Richard Nixon's veto, specifically to curb presidential unilateralism in military conflicts. Now, the WPR mandates that the president must notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying U.S. forces into hostilities or situations where hostilities are imminent. Furthermore, it requires that military actions must cease within 60 days or 90 days in emergencies unless Congress provides specific approval through a declaration of war or other authorization. Lawmakers, including Representative Thomas Massey, a Republican from Kentucky, and Senator Tim Kaine, he is a Democrat from, I believe he's from Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, had introduced resolutions prior to the June 2025 strikes explicitly aimed to prohibit military action in Iran without congressional approval. Massey notably tweeted, "This is not our war, but if it were, Congress must decide such matters according to our Constitution. I'm introducing a bipartisan war powers resolution to prohibit our involvement." And that could have been one of the urgencies that Trump saw in taking this action now before that resolution was voted on. Now, the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel, or OLC, has, in its own opinions, acknowledged that the declare war clause might impose a potential restriction on the president's Article 2 powers. If a planned engagement escalates to the level of a war, the OLC standard for this determination requires a fact-specific assessment of the anticipated nature, scope, and duration of the planned military operations, generally met only by prolonged and substantial military engagements, typically involving exposure of U.S. military personnel to significant risk over a substantial period. Critics argue that a military strike against Iran, given its potential for retaliation and escalation, would definitely constitute a very significant stretch of presidential authority under these criteria. Now, the ongoing debate surrounding the June 2025 strikes is not new, but rather a reoccurring manifestation of a persistent constitutional friction within the U.S. government. This tension, pitting the executive branch's desire for flexibility and speed in foreign policy against the legislative branch's assertion of its constitutional role in authorizing military force, highlights a systemic challenge. The lack of a definitive legal resolution to this power struggle means that each significant military action abroad tends to reignite the same constitutional arguments, contributing to a cycle where the exercise of war powers remains politically contentious and legally ambiguous. Now let's take a look at the domestic political reactions to the attacks on Iran. Now, the domestic political landscape reacted sharply and largely along partisan lines to President Trump's unilateral strikes. Let's take a look at the Republican support. Many Republican lawmakers quickly voiced their approval for President Trump's decisive action. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina posted, "Well done, President Trump." Senator Katie Britt of Alabama described the bombings as strong and surgical, while Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, stated that President Trump has made a deliberate and correct decision to eliminate the existential threat posed by the Iranian regime. Meanwhile, Representative John Johnson noted that the military operation should serve as a clear reminder that our adversaries and allies that President Trump means what he says. Senator John Fetterman of Pennsylvania, a vocal supporter of Israel, also praised the attacks, asserting that Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and cannot have nuclear capabilities. Now let's take a look at the other side from the Democratic opposition and calls for congressional action. Conversely, Democrats largely condemned the unilateral nature of the strikes and demanded congressional involvement. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer stated no president should be allowed to unilaterally march this nation into something as consequential as war with erratic threats and no strategy. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries accused President Trump of having misled the country about his intentions, failed to seek congressional authorization for the use of military force, and risks American entanglement in a potentially disastrous war in the Middle East. Now, some Democrats went even further, explicitly suggesting that the action constituted an impeachable offense. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, we know that she is very vocal, and she stated that President Trump's move was absolutely and clearly grounds for impeachment, adding, "No president has the authority to bomb another country that does not pose an imminent threat to the U.S. without the approval of Congress. This is an unambiguous, impeachable offense." Now, House Minority Whip Kathleen Clark from Massachusetts was equally direct, affirming the power to declare war resides solely with Congress. Donald Trump's unilateral decision to attack Iran is unauthorized and unconstitutional. Now, when it comes to bipartisan concerns, the reactions were predominantly partisan. Some Republicans also expressed constitutional reservations. Representative Warren Davidson from Ohio, typically aligned with President Trump, posted, "While President Trump's decision may prove just, it's hard to conceive a rationale that's constitutional." Now, the congressional reactions vividly illustrate a stark partisan divide, with Republicans largely defending the exercise of executive power and Democrats predominantly condemning it as an overreach. The pattern suggests that the constitutional interpretations of war powers are frequently influenced by political alignment rather than purely legal principle. When a president from one's own party acts, there is often a tendency to defend broad executive authority, and conversely, when a president from an opposing party acts, there is greater emphasis on congressional checks and balances. This politicalization undermines the consistent application of constitutional principles and complicates the establishment of clear predicaments for military action, thereby contributing to a recurring cycle of executive unilateralism met by legislative protest. Now let's take a look at some of the specific U.S. officials and congressional reactions to the strikes. Now, Donald Trump, of course, he directed the strikes and claimed that they were a very successful attack, completely and totally obliterated. Now is the time for peace. Now, I think that he has his head up his ass if he honestly believes that there is going to be no retaliation or reaction by Iran. Unfortunately, I do believe that there is a very imminent threat of a retaliation by Iran, not only from what they said, but judging by history. Now, Lindsey Graham, of course, said, "Well done, President Trump," while Katie Britt, Senator, she, of course, supported Trump again, saying bombings were strong and surgical. Roger Wicker, Senator, Armed Services Chair, Trump made deliberate and correct decision to eliminate the existential threat posed by the Iranian regime. John Johnson, as I said earlier, he went on to support Trump, saying it should serve as a clear reminder to our adversaries and allies that President Trump means what he says. Again, we've talked about Chuck Schumer, John Fetterman, Kim Jeffries, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So we've already covered their reactions as well as many others. Now, in terms of international law and the UN framework, this is where we start to take a look at the contravention analysis. Now, prohibition on the use of force, and that is UN Charter Article 2, subsection 4. At the core of the international legal framework governing the use of force is Article 2, subsection 4 of the United Nations Charter. This provision is considered a fundamental principle in international law of unequivocally prohibiting the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. This article establishes a general and robust rule against unilateral use of force by individual states, serving as a cornerstone for maintaining international peace and security in the post-World War II era. Now, the right to self-defense under the UN Charter Article 51. The only explicit exception to sweeping prohibition on the use of force under the UN Charter is enshrined in Article 51. This article permits individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations until the Security Council has taken measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. International jurisprudence, notably from the International Criminal Court of Justice, has consistently interpreted armed attack as requiring grave forms of the use of force. Beyond the occurrence of the armed attack, the right to self-defense is subject to strict customary international law conditions. Now, you have to look at several points. Now, the imminence. The threat must be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means, no moment of deliberation. Critics frequently point out that the term imminence is not explicitly present in Article 51, which strictly states if an armed attack occurs. Now, the necessity, there must be no other viable alternative to the use of military force to address the threat, and proportionality. The force employed must be limited to what is strictly necessary to repel the attack and must be proportionate to the injury suffered. Now, that is where the question is called in about the legality under those provisions of the United States action. Now let's take a look at the contravention arguments and the legality of the June 2025 strikes. Now, the preventative strike versus self-defense. Legal scholars and international bodies largely contend that the June 2025 strikes, framed as preventative strike against Iran's nuclear latency, its potential future capability to develop nuclear weapons, rather than an imminent armed attack, do not satisfy the criteria for lawful self-defense under Article 51. The fact that the U.S. intelligence agencies had assessed that Tehran was not actively pursuing a bomb further undermines the justification of an imminent threat. Now, their next point is the lack of UN Security Council authorization. And a big notation on this is that the UN Charter permits the use of force by a state only in self-defense or if explicitly authorized by the UN Security Council. There is no indication that the United States obtained such authorization for the June 2025 strikes. In response, Iran's ambassador to the United States quickly called for an urgent Security Council meeting to address what Tehran described as the illegal use of force. Now, the violation of sovereignty in that any military action conducted on the territory of another sovereign state without its explicit consent is generally considered a violation of its sovereignty and a breach of Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter. The strikes on Iranian soil directly fall under this significant critique. Now, let's take a look at the precedent from the Soleimani strike. The 2020 assassination of the Iranian general, which the U.S. justified as a measure to prevent an imminent attack, was widely considered by numerous legal experts and the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial, summary, or arbitrary executions as a likely violation of international law and U.S. domestic laws. Iran labeled the strike as an act of state terrorism and a gross violation of the fundamental principles of international law. The legal arguments raised against the Soleimani strike, including questions of imminence, necessity, proportionality, and the violation of Iraqi sovereignty, and that serves as highly relevant precedents for the legal challenges to the 2025 strikes. The central point of contention in the international legal debate lies in the United States' expansive interpretation of self-defense and imminent threat. This is particularly evident when these concepts are applied to preventative strikes against a state's potential nuclear capabilities. This interpretation starkly contrasts with the strict, widely accepted international legal standards under the UN Charter Article 51, which generally requires an actual armed attack to trigger the right of self-defense. This divergence highlights a pattern where the United States, as a powerful state, asserts the right to unilateral action that many other nations and legal experts perceived as undermining the foundational principles of the UN Charter and customary international law. This approach risks establishing a dangerous precedent for the international rules-based order, potentially encouraging other states to adopt similarly broad interpretations of self-defense, which could lead to a more unstable global environment. Now, the impact on the non-proliferation regime. Critics argue that such preventative strikes against nuclear latency rather than actual proliferation make a mockery of international law and could have profoundly detrimental effects on the global non-proliferation regime. The argument posits that if states that refrain from developing nuclear weapons can be attacked based on mere suspicion or potential capability, while those that are already possessing them are often tolerated, it creates a grim paradox. This situation, is argued, does not incentivize restraint, it rewards defiance. The underlying concern is that such actions could inadvertently push more states to accelerate their pursuit of nuclear weapons, viewing them as the only reliable deterrent against external military intervention. The long-term consequence of this dynamic could be more nuclear-armed world and a direct contradiction to the stated goal of non-proliferation and a significant increase in global security risks. Now let's take a look at the UN and international body responses, because this is very important about how the world is responding to Donald Trump and his actions in the US military. Now, the United Nations and various international bodies responded with significant concern to the U.S. strikes. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, expressed grave alarm over the dangerous escalation of the American strikes, issuing stark warning of a growing risk that this conflict could rapidly get out of control. While catastrophic consequences for civilians, the region, and the world, he consistently advocated for de-escalation and urged maximum restraint, emphasizing that the world cannot afford another war in the Gulf. The International Atomic Energy Agency responded, and that's the UN's nuclear watchdog, reported that there was no increase in off-site radiation levels at the locations hit by the U.S., providing an initial assessment of these immediate environmental impact. Rafael Grossi, the UN nuclear chief, urged a return to serious negotiations to establish a credible, comprehensive, and verifiable solution to Iran's nuclear program. In direct response to the strike, Iran's ambassador to the United Nations formally called for an emergency Security Council meeting to discuss the U.S.'s heinous attacks and illegal use of force against Iran. The ambassador demanded that the UN's most powerful body take all necessary measures to hold the United States accountable for their actions under international law and the UN Charter. The grave alarm expressed by the UN Secretary General and the widespread calls for maximum restraint from the international community reflect deep concern about the escalating situation. Iran's immediate appeal to the UN Security Council demonstrates its attempt to leverage the international legal framework and multilateral institutions against the United States' actions. However, the nature of the UN's response largely confined to rhetorical condemnation and calls for diplomacy rather than immediate enforcement action against a permanent Security Council member, highlights the inherent limitations of the UN's collective security mechanism when a powerful state acts unilaterally. This underscores a significant gap between established international legal norms and their practical enforcement, particularly in instances involving major global powers like the United States. Now, let's take a look at the international legal arguments and the U.S. justification versus the UN Charter principles. Now, we'll go through this as an overview. Now, the international legal interpretation or critique is basically where the UN Charter is looked at in these particular interpretations. Now, the prohibition on use of force is Article 2, Section 4, and that is, again, the protection of national security and foreign policy interests, deterring future Iranian attack plans. And when you take a look at that, the claim was action against nuclear latency is not an armed attack justifying force, violates territorial integrity. And again, we went through a lot of the other parts of the right to self-defense under Article 51 as well. And then necessity, of course, we looked at that as the only way to prevent such actions. And again, that was not the case in this. Proportionality, force must be proportionate to injuries suffered. Questions if the target was the only means. So again, it's a lot of interpretation by the different factors, whether that's the UN Security Council and other states that are members of the UN, or whether it's the US legal interpretation. Again, it is a very murky water that has never really been clarified. So again, it makes it very difficult. Now, the Iranian responses, of course, the immediate and forceful reaction from Iran's leadership underscored the gravity of the U.S. strikes and signaled an intent for retaliation. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, issued a stern warning of harsh retaliation against the United States. President Hassan Rouhani echoed this sentiment, stating unequivocally that Iran will take revenge. Zainab Soleimani, the daughter of the assassinated Qasem Soleimani, delivered a chilling warning during her father's funeral, declaring that the families of the American soldiers in Western Asia will spend their days waiting for the death of their children. Now, Iranian officials also launched strong accusations of illegality and state terrorism. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif described the attack on social media as an extremely dangerous and a foolish escalation, directly accusing the U.S. of international terrorism and asserting that the U.S. bears responsibility for all consequences of its rogue adventurism, as they called it. Majid Takht Ravanchi, Iran's permanent representative to the United Nations, sent an official letter to the UN Security Council and Secretary General characterizing the act as an obvious example of state terrorism and, as a criminal act, constitutes a gross violation of the fundamental principles of international law, including in particular those stipulated in the Charter of the United Nations. Now, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi further accused Washington of committing a grave violation of the UN Charter, international law, and the NPT by attacking Iran's peaceful nuclear installations. Now, domestically, Iran undertook measures reflecting its resolve. Its parliament approved a substantial $200 million increase in the budget for the Quds Force and voted to officially declare the United States Armed Forces as terrorist organization. Symbolically, a red flag representing vengeance was unfurled above the dome of the Jamkaren Mosque. The strong and immediate vows of harsh retaliation from Iran's highest leadership and military figures indicate that Iran is unlikely to absorb these strikes without a response. The mention of Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen stated that they would resume attacks on U.S. vessels in the Red Sea. And the general expectation that reprisals will likely focus on U.S. troops in the region of the Red Sea and other American assets suggests that while a direct state-on-state conflict might be avoided, asymmetric warfare and proxy attacks are highly probable. This implies that the strikes, rather than effectively deterring Iran, have likely increased the immediate threat to U.S. personnel and interests across the region, leading to a prolonged period of heightened instability and significant potential for unintended escalation. Now, reactions from key regional and international actors came in swiftly. The U.S. strikes elicited varied but largely concerned reactions from key regional and international actors. But let's start with Israel. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was quick to congratulate President Trump, stating that the attack would change the history of the Middle East and beyond. He lauded Trump's bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities with the awesome and righteous might of the United States, and explicitly confirmed that the U.S. and Israel acted in full coordination. Now, as I stated, Iraqi response was also swift. Now, the Iraqi caretaker Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, condemned the attack as an aggression on Iraq, a flagrant violation of Iraq's sovereignty, and a dangerous escalation that triggers a destructive war in Iraq, the region, and the world. Syria also responded, saying that the Syrian government accused Washington of attempting to fuel conflict in the Middle East and described the killings as a serious escalation of the situation in the region. Meanwhile, the Turkish foreign minister expressed deep concern, stating that the assassination would increase insecurity and instability in the region, and reiterated that Turkey has always been against foreign interventions, assassinations, and sectarian conflict in the region. Moscow, meanwhile, warned that the assassination would increase tensions throughout the region and characterized the killing of Soleimani as an adventurous step. Now, NATO, in the meanwhile, the military alliance temporarily suspended its training mission in Iraq, citing concerns for the safety of its personnel. And again, we're looking at not just the attack against Iraq over the last 24 hours, but also they were reacting to the previous actions of the United States government. Now, the reactions from regional actors such as Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, alongside major powers like Russia, highlighted significant concern regarding the erosion of state sovereignty and the palpable risk of wider regional conflict. Iraq's strong condemnation of the strike as a violation of its sovereignty underscores the fragility of regional alliances and the inherent risk of further destabilization when major powers undertake unilateral military actions. This pattern points to a broader geopolitical trend where interventions, even those aimed at specific targets, can inadvertently undermine the stability of allied or neighboring states, thereby creating a more complex and volatile security environment. We also need to keep in mind that with Trump taking these actions unilaterally and not speaking out to the United Nations or other Security Council personnel members or others, it really takes away his ability to act as an authority when it comes to the Russian attacks on Ukraine and other international conflicts and crises that are underway. Now, beyond the immediate regional actors, the broader international community responded with a mix of alarm calls for restraint and diplomatic appeals. The United Nations once again expressed grave alarm and urged maximum restraint, stating that the world cannot afford another war in the Gulf. Meanwhile, Foreign Minister Winston Peters from New Zealand urged all parties to return to talks, describing the crisis as the most serious he had ever dealt with and emphasizing the critical need to avoid further escalation. China weighed in and Beijing appealed for restraint from all sides, especially the United States, and questioned whether the U.S. was repeating its Iraq mistakes in Iran, advocating for a measured diplomatic approach over military confrontation. Meanwhile, Japan and South Korea, both prime ministers, convened emergency meetings to address the security and economic implications of the U.S. attack. Australia called for a diplomatic resolution acknowledging Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile program as a threat to international peace and security, but reiterated calls for de-escalation, dialogue, and diplomacy. The European nations, UK, France, and Germany, and the EU expressed deep concern and urged restraint and de-escalation. French Secretary of State for European Affairs, Émile de Montchalin, stated, "We have woken up to a more dangerous world." These nations also reiterated their concerns about the expansion of Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, Argentina and Brazil expressed worry about the escalating situation and urged diplomacy, while Brazil's president supported any initiative against terrorism and reaffirmed his support for Donald Trump's actions. Excuse me one moment, folks. Let me go back to that. My apologies, it switched off on us. Okay, and let's continue on here. To Canada urged restraint and de-escalation of tensions while also acknowledging long-standing concerns regarding the destabilization and their destabilizing actions of Iran's Quds force under Soleimani. The varied responses from the international community, ranging from outright condemnation to cautious calls for diplomacy and explicit support, highlight a fragmented international landscape. Now, this fragmentation underscores the significant challenges to collective action and the weakening of a multilateral institution such as the UN in effectively addressing unilateral military actions by major powers. The U.S. strike has demonstrably strained international relations, making it more difficult to build a consensus on critical global security issues and potentially pushing the world towards a more fractured and less predictable geopolitical environment. Now, non-state actors have responded as well, such as Iranian-backed groups, the Houthi rebels in Yemen, stating they would resume attacks on U.S. vessels in the Red Sea if the Trump administration continues its military campaign alongside of Israel. Meanwhile, Hezbollah leader Syed Hassan Nasrallah called for Soleimani's death to be avenged, asserting that it would be the responsibility and task of all resistance fighters worldwide. Meanwhile, Palestinian groups Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad also condemned the U.S. action and expressed support for Soleimani, highlighting his role as supporting Palestinian resistance. Meanwhile, Iranian opposition groups have also come out in contrast. Some Iranian opposition groups welcome the U.S. action. The People's Mojahid, organization, or the PMOI, as exiled militant groups, they viewed the killing as an irreparable blow to the regime of mullahs. Now, the heir to the throne of the defunct imperial state of Iran also strongly backed the airstrike, describing it as a breakthrough that is a positive one for the entire region. As I said, we have taken a look at the international response. We've taken a look at the different areas in which it is being justified by the United States in some region, by some individuals and representatives, while being also looked at as a violation of the Constitution as well. So again, further pushing Donald Trump into a constitutional crisis and the American people. Now, the June 2025 U.S. attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities represents a significant inflection point in the complex relationship between Washington and Tehran. This action clearly demonstrates a strategic shift in U.S. policy, moving from a prolonged period of economic pressure to direct military intervention. The strikes have ignited profound constitutional debates domestically, particularly concerning the boundaries of presidential war powers versus congressional authority. Simultaneously, they have provoked widespread international condemnation over the legality under fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The justification for these strikes, framed as a preventative strike against Iran's potential nuclear capabilities rather than an immediate armed attack, challenge established norms of international law and carry the risk of setting dangerous precedents for further state conduct. Now, the immediate aftermath suggests a high probability of Iranian retaliation, likely through proxies or asymmetric means, which will undoubtedly increase risks to U.S. personnel and assets throughout the region. This will contribute to a continued regional instability and heightened tensions. In the long term, the implications are even more profound, which preventative strikes risk eroding the international non-proliferation regime, potentially creating a perverse incentive for states to accelerate their pursuit of nuclear weapons as a deterrent against similar interventions. This could further strain international rules-based order and weaken multilateral institutions like the United Nations. Domestically, the partisan divide within the United States on foreign policy and executive authority is likely to deepen, making consistent policy more challenging. Now, the path forward is precarious. While international calls for de-escalation and diplomacy are widespread, the fundamental disagreements over Iran's nuclear program and the legality of the U.S. action remain unresolved. The immediate future holds the potential for either a return to fraught negotiations, perhaps under renewed international pressure, or a dangerous slide into a wider regional conflict with far-reaching global ramifications. The ultimate effectiveness of the strikes in achieving their stated goal, permanently setting back Iran's nuclear programs, remains to be seen, and their true cost, both in human terms and geopolitical stability, may only become fully apparent over time. Once again, you've been watching another episode of Live Chat with James at the ProPix TV studios in Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you for tuning in for this special edition of the show. Once again, if you have comments, you're always welcome to leave them in the comments section. We do review them even when the show is rebroadcast on various different platforms. But again, we do read your comments and appreciate them at all times. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel, and also share it with others so we can get pushed up in the algorithms and build our following base and subscriber base. Once again, you've been watching James Cousineau here at ProPix TV in Vancouver, British Columbia. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and once again, thanks for tuning in.